Okay, so this is the second podcast, which you probably already know, which is why you've pressed on it. So, moving on a little bit then, thinking about ideas of representing the unrepresentable. So, it's this kind of notion that there is something that is so horrendously heinous, so terrible, that we cannot express it. It becomes unrepresentable. Now it's quite interesting because Elie Wiesel talks about kind of ideas of silence in his work. Wiesel is somebody who both experienced the Holocaust as a Jewish survivor, but also sort of wrote both critically and creatively about his kind of experiences. And he really sees this kind of idea of silence as being a real cop-out, and actually reinforcing actually some of the concerns, some of the problems with the Holocaust in particular. So, if you were to say to me what are the current kind of buzzwords, ideas and areas in literary theory, one of them, or two of them rather, are kind of really interrelated, would be memory studies and also trauma theory as well. So you can see how through Holocaust fiction we might actually be dealing with two of the most up-to-date areas of literary theory. So if you're interested in this idea of memory, then actually reading somebody's work like Anne Whitehead from Newcastle University, who's written the critical idiom series on memory, I think should be a very, very useful overview, because I appreciate that not all of you are going to be using a Holocaust adaptation. Maybe one or two out of the whole group, but a number of you will be entertaining ideas of memory or maybe ideas of trauma. So use today's session as a way of kind of unlocking some of the areas that you're thinking about in relation to your own project. So part of the issue, I suppose, in terms of the Holocaust is this just enormous nature of it, that it almost becomes unthinkable. So again, you have what we term this kind of crisis of representation. How do we deal with that? So actually, we were talking about kind of postmodernism the other week, talking about the tricksiness and the playfulness of that. Part of that is a kind of a response to these ideas of representation. So having somebody like Art Spiegelman with his graphic novel Mouse, using the kind of characters of the mice and the cats as a way of exploring Nazi and Jewish relations is really interesting. He's using this kind of different kind of approach. Similarly with Plath, using that kind of very difficult imagery, very difficult kind of rhythm and kind of rhyme schemes as well. Part of the concern as well, sort of regarding the Holocaust, is to do with language. So what Primo Levi does very well in If This Is a Man is he shows the way in which language has been corrupted. So if you're familiar with the work of sort of linguists, you might have done some work on kind of ideas of language and reality. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which sounds like it should be from Star Trek but isn't. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is to do with the relationship between language and reality. So for most of us, we would imagine that reality constructs our language. But actually for Sapir-Whorf and for most linguists and post-structuralists, it's actually the other way around. So it's language that constructs what it is that we've got. So the very often cited example is the idea of the Inuit people and their 15 zillion words for snow. So having lots of different ways of kind of expressing that. We experience snow, we experience lots of different types of snow, but we don't actually have the language to kind of engage with that. So our reality is affected because of that. So what's all this got to do with the Holocaust then? Well, if you talk about people as rats, as subhuman, as rags, which is the phrase that's always stuck in my mind from If This Is a Man, it utterly dehumanises them, and you have this process then that you're experiencing. And I think Spielberg does that quite well in the film through the kind of the Nazi officer in particular, and then Schindler's reactions to that. He never forgets that the people he is working with are people, and that's the power, I think, of Nielsen's sort of characterization, that he never allows the character to forget that he's dealing with people, even when he's got that kind of tension between money and sort of running away from kind of the situation. So discourses of language and power. So looking at somebody perhaps like Foucault, looking at Norman Fairclough's work on kind of language and power might give you a really interesting insight if that's something you want to kind of explore. Those of you who are doing science fiction work and maybe thinking about different language structure, again, think about ideas of kind of language and power in this sense. So a good sort of scientific example then would be from something like The Handmaid's Tale, which is using language in a very kind of particular way. So I mentioned a little bit about Levy. He's not the only person in particular who are seen as being part of this kind of witness, first generation of experience of kind of the Holocaust in particular. So one of the areas around Holocaust studies is notions in particular of authenticity. So did somebody experience what it is they're saying they experienced? And Levy in particular, you have to remember, is a very, very good writer. And although he's replicating elements of narrative, you're never far from this awareness actually that it is still a fictional account, and that is very important. And it's also important he starts off with a poem, which is a very beautiful poem as well, so you might want to have a look at the opening of If This Is a Man, if that's something that interests you. What Levy does very well in that novel is draw on this notion of the complicity, if you like, with some members of society with the Nazi regime. And again, that's something very, very particular, I think, to Schindler's List. You can really get a sense of the Jewish populace, acting as this kind of police within the ghetto and then within the prison camps as well, creating a different kind of culpability and a different kind of relationship then to the events that kind of unfold, and that's difficult. It's difficult to think about kind of post-war, how they would have been viewed within the societies in which they kind of functioned. So I think Levy puts it very well actually, and I'll get to this kind of notion in a little bit, but he talks in particular about this complicity. So actually using Jewish people to do this very, very dirty work, to be progressing, making the choices about who lives and dies, whether or not they were aware of that, initially, and the sort of the decisions then, and then sort of being treated, the fellow Jews, fellow people, and again in this subordinate way. And Levy is very clever in the way he represents this, because he goes particularly to think about this kind of idea of language. So actually, if language is referring to people in this way, then you won't be treated in a moralistic manner. So here's some extracts from his novel The Drowned and the Saved, and it's a line that's always stayed with me, and I want to just sort of get you to think about it. Certainly I could have killed myself or got myself killed, but I wanted to survive, to avenge myself and bear witness. This notion of bearing witness is something that's very, very important, and whether or not this is being used as an excuse here is something for you to sort of consider. You mustn't think that we're monsters. We are the same as you, only much more unhappy. And I just think that's a very, very interesting piece of writing, and the way in which he's problematising the way in which we might stigmatise these particular characters, and whether or not we believe this kind of narrative voice at this point as well. Moving on a little bit, you will be very familiar from the film, and perhaps some images of Auschwitz in particular, the use and the building up of I talked about archive earlier on, but property, of belongings, of people being kind of displaced. So I want you to spend a little bit of time here, and there's three things that I think would be very, very beneficial for you to be looking at and thinking about. So the one is the way in which materiality or economy is represented in the film. So think about everything from from Schlinder, the way in which he talks about money and status, to the clothes that he wears and the reaction that he gets, you know, right down to the sort of the suitcases and the unloading of luggage. So on the one hand, there is this kind of economy around the kind of material goods within the film. Another area that I think is very, very worthy of consideration is ideas of technology. So thinking about technology, and that technology can range right from the factory to the railway, to actually the gas chambers themselves. So I think that as well, you know, is an area that's very, very worthy of sort of consideration. The third area is focusing literally on what I've been terming this kind of idea of the archive. So this museum, almost a mausoleum if you like, of different items that are piled up, and then the ways in which those various characters kind of respond to those. So those are three very, very large areas. The ideas of the materials, the economy, the ideas of technology, and then finally the ideas of the archive. So just jot those down. I don't expect you to kind of consider each in turn particularly. You might want to just focus on one, because as a director you might be then drawing out elements of you know, of those particular themes, which I think this director does in particular. So have a little think about that, and think about how that might relate then to your project. You know, are the themes that the story is drawing up that you want to demonstrate visually? So I'm gonna pause this there. And this will be sort of the end of this sort of second podcast, because I want to pick up some of those ideas, and they really help us relate, I think, if we see them with the clips.